The moment the words left Alan Dershowitz's mouth, the air in the room shifted. His voice carried that familiar blend of patronizing calm and sharpened condescension. The kind of tone polished in Ivy League lecture halls and cable news green rooms. "I'm not sure," he said, pausing just long enough to let the cameras lean in. That Representative Jasmine Crockett truly understands the law at the level her degree claims. It wasn't just the statement, it was the smug curl of confidence behind it, the implication that pedigree mattered more than lived experience, more than grit, more than the kind of knowledge earned in real communities rather than carved-out institutions. A murmur rippled across the room. Some shifted in their seats, others looked away. Uncomfortable with how easily arrogance can masquerade as authority, Dershowitz leaned back as if he'd delivered something irrefutable, as if the weight of his reputation alone should crush dissent. His eyes flickered with a certainty that the jab would land, that this younger, black, unapologetically assertive congresswoman would shrink beneath the shadow of his legacy. It was the kind of moment designed to humble, to belittle, to remind. The world who supposedly belonged at the top of the legal food chain, and for a heartbeat, even the cameras seemed to brace for the expected reaction. Defensiveness. Maybe anger, maybe retreat, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin with a deliberate steadiness, her expression soft but unyielding, her posture rooted in the quiet confidence of someone who has been underestimated her entire life and learned to turn that underestimation into fuel. Her eyes didn't narrow, they focused. Her breath didn't quicken, it settled. She didn't rush to fill the silence he'd created. She let it stretch, let his insult hang in the air long enough for its full pettiness to reveal itself. In that stillness, something powerful formed, an unspoken reminder that strength isn't always loud, that dignity doesn't need to announce itself, that a person who has lived their truth doesn't tremble when someone questions the paper. Proves it. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift, sensing that Dershowitz's arrogance had just lit a fuse he didn't see sparking toward him, and beneath that calm surface, one truth became undeniable. No one, least of all Dershowitz, was prepared for how she'd respond. What Dershowitz said might have sounded, on the surface, like a simple critique in academic questioning and other professionals' credentials. But for millions watching, it was instantly clear that this moment was anything but ordinary. It wasn't just about a law degree. It wasn't just about a debate. It wasn't even about two public figures disagreeing. It was about the quiet, coded elitism that has followed black professionals, especially black women, into every room they've ever entered. It was about the smirk behind the words, the assumption wrapped in prestige that someone like Jasmine Crockett must prove her legitimacy twice over while her critics coast on name recognition alone. For generations, this dynamic has played out. In courtrooms, universities, boardrooms, and political chambers, the attack on Crockett's education tapped directly into that history. It carried the unspoken suggestion that a black woman's achievements are somehow suspect, that her credentials must be scrutinized under a microscope while men with louder voices glide by on unchallenged authority. It was the kind of subtle diminishment that forces people of colors, especially women, to brace themselves, to wonder whether skill will matter as much as who grants you permission to speak. The double standard is as old as American politics itself. When a white male figure raises his voice, he is assertive. When a black woman speaks with clarity, she is angry. When he interrupts, he is passionate. When she pushes back, she is disrespectful. So, when Dershowitz questioned her understanding of the law, it wasn't a neutral observation, it was a familiar script. I meant to undermine her not on the merits, but on the assumptions baked into generations of cultural bias. And yet, what made this moment cut even deeper was how perfectly it illustrated the widening divide between two eras of American legal and political power. On one side stood Alan Dershowitz, emblem of the old guard, a man whose influence was built in institutions that for decades excluded people who look like Jasmine Crockett. His authority has long been tied to the prestige of those institutions, the idea that power flows downward from elite spaces. On the other side stood Crockett, younger, sharper, shaped not by the approval of legacy systems, but by lived realities. She represents a rising generation of leaders who don't wait for validation from the gatekeepers who once held all the keys. This wasn't merely about credentials. It was about whose experience counts, whose intelligence is acknowledged, whose voice is allowed to redefine the conversation. The impact resonated far beyond that room. Immigrant families watching saw echoes of their own children questioned for being too new or not traditional enough. Young black women felt the sting of every moment they had been talked down to, dismissed, or patronized. People who worked twice as hard to earn half the respect recognized the tactic instantly. The insult hit a nerve because it exposed a broader truth. Leadism doesn't always announce itself boldly. Sometimes it arrives dressed as polite skepticism. Sometimes it hides behind a resume. Sometimes it spreads its wings under the name of expertise. But everyone who has ever been belittled by someone with more titles than humility knew exactly what Dershowitz was doing. And that is why this moment mattered, because it wasn't isolated. It was symbolic. It was generational. It was cultural. It was about a country wrestling with who gets to define expertise and who gets dismissed as merely pretending to have it. And yet, the insult was only the spark. The explosion came next. Long before the cameras caught him taking a swipe at Jasmine Crockett, Alan Dershowitz had built a reputation that once stood nearly untouchable. For decades, he was the name whispered with reverence in legal circles, the Harvard professor whose courtroom strategies became case studies, the civil liberties defender whose arguments shaped national debates. He was the man students quoted, journalists consulted, and politicians cautiously respected. His credentials sparkled with the sheen of someone who had not only mastered the field but defined parts of it. There was a time when simply invoking his name signaled gravitas. But that golden era feels distant now, overshadowed by a complicated, often chaotic evolution. The Dershowitz who stands in the public eye today is not the same one who strode across ivy-covered campuses with effortless authority. Over the years, he drifted from celebrated scholar to constant headline generator, a man who could stir controversy simply by entering a conversation. Somewhere along the line, admiration gave way to confusion, then skepticism, and eventually exhaustion. The public watched as he waded into scandal-adjacent debates, defended figures whose causes perplexed his former allies, and appeared on television. Panels where the tone had less to do with legal nuance and more to do with spectacle. As his public persona expanded, so did the cracks. His commentary grew sharper, more erratic, more combative. He began punching down, not debating equals, but talking over younger voices, women, and people of color who represented the new guard of political leadership. His arguments no longer felt like masterclasses. It felt like attempts to reclaim a stature that was slipping. Even longtime colleagues whispered that he seemed determined to remind the world of a relevance he feared losing. Patterns emerged. Whenever he was challenged, he would lean on his resume, holding it up like a shield, as though years of accolades could compensate for the brittleness in his tone. If someone questioned his stance, he reacted with disproportionate intensity. If someone offered a new perspective, he dismissed it with an almost visceral resistance. It wasn't confidence. It was defensiveness masquerading as bravado. Time and again, he defaulted to the same strategy. Interrupt, overtalk, overwhelm. The louder he became, the more transparent the insecurity behind the volume. And this transformation did not go unnoticed. Younger generations, shaped by a different political landscape, began to view him less as a giant and more as a relic, someone still reciting the lines that once dazzled, unaware that the audience had changed. Even among seasoned analysts, there was a growing sense that his arguments carried more heat than substance, more ego than insight. The authority he once wielded with such ease now seemed borrowed from another era, a time when the gatekeepers of truth all looked like him. That tension between the prestige he built and the public reaction he now provokes forms the core of the Dershowitz paradox. He is a man who amassed extraordinary intellectual power, but now appears threatened by anyone who doesn't conform to the establishment mold he once helped enforce. He champions civil liberties, but bristles when challenged by those who fight them from new angles. He taught generations of lawyers to question everything, It grows visibly irritated when someone questions him, to understand his jab at Jasmine Crockett. One must understand the unraveling beneath the surface. It wasn't just a critique. It was the reaction of someone watching the center of gravity shift away from him. In Crockett, he saw a kind of leader he was never trained to respect. Young, black, forceful, unafraid to push back against institutions that once bowed to him. She didn't rise through the old channels. She didn't seek permission from traditional power structures. Her strength came from a different source, one he doesn't know how to measure, and that is precisely why the insult carried such weight. Too many, it felt like the last gasp of an outdated hierarchy clinging to relevance in a world that is rapidly diversifying, modernizing, and refusing to accept the old rules of who gets to claim expertise. The more he leaned into his credentials, the more it appeared that he feared what they no longer guaranteed. Prestige, after all, is only as strong as the culture that upholds its hand. That culture is shifting beneath his feet as he spoke down to her. There was a tremor in his certainty, a faint quiver of someone who realizes, too late, that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned anew. And in that moment, as the nation watching could sense it, the tug-of-war between past authority and present accountability, between entitlement and evolution. But the louder the professor shouted, the more obvious it became that something was cracking. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever stood under the bright lights of Congress, she walked roads that rarely make it into political biographies, the kind paved with long hours, second-hand textbooks, and the stubborn determination of someone who refused to let circumstance dictate her destiny. She grew up in working-class Texas, in neighborhoods where resilience wasn't a virtue but a requirement, where families stitched together community in the absence of institutional support, and where young people learned early that opportunity wasn't something handed out, but something fought for. In that environment, Jasmine didn't just witness struggle. She lived alongside it, absorbing the lessons that would later shape every fight she took on. Her path to law wasn't lined with legacy or privilege. While others entered the legal world through family connections and polished networks, she entered it through grit. Hustling through college wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was literal. She worked jobs between classes, studied during breaks, and learned early how to navigate systems never designed with her in mind. Law school was another battlefield, one where she often found herself the only black woman in the room, facing professors who doubted her seriousness and peers who underestimated her capability. But where others relied on the confidence inherited from generations of academic access, Jasmine relied on something sturdier, the lived understanding that law is only worth something if it serves people left behind. When she became a public defender, she stepped directly into the heart of that mission. She wasn't defending clients from afar. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with people whose lives had been shaped by poverty, discrimination, and systemic neglect. She saw up close what happens when the legal system fails the communities it claims to protect. She saw the cycle of punishment that swallowed families whole, the hopelessness of courtrooms that treated some lives as disposable, and the frustration of clients who never had a fighting chance until someone like her walked through the door. It was here that Crockett's voice began to sharpen, not from anger, but from clarity. She didn't just practice law. She embodied the reason law should exist. Her work evolved naturally into civil rights litigation. If the courtroom failed people, she would challenge it. If policies harmed communities, she would expose them. If institutions hid behind procedure, she would drag the truth into the light. She fought police misconduct, discriminatory practices, the deep-rooted inequities that had been ignored for generations. Her cases weren't glamorous, they were personal. She was defending people who reminded her of home, of childhood, of neighbors whose stories rarely made headlines. Every win mattered. Every loss pushed her harder. Every injustice strengthened her resolve, but what truly set her apart was the way. She connected legal work with community work. She didn't isolate herself in an office. She showed up at grassroots meetings, listened to organizers, knocked doors, marched in the streets, and stood beside those whose voices had been muffled by institutional power. She wasn't building a brand, she was building trust. People saw themselves in her not because she spoke for them, but because she spoke with them. That distinction shaped her rise from local activism to statewide. influenced her candidacy for office wasn't backed by the usual political machinery. It was propelled by the communities she served, the people who knew that when Jasmine Crockett entered a room, she brought their stories with her. Her authenticity wasn't a crafted persona. It was the inevitable result of living a life rooted in struggle and uplift. When she stood on debate stages, she didn't mimic the polished restraint of establishment politicians. She brought a voice that was sharp, fiery, and unapologetically real. The kind that refuses to shrink itself to make others comfortable, and that is exactly why her presence in Congress feels so different. She doesn't wear titles like armor. She doesn't rely on institutions to validate her. She doesn't quote legal doctrine to sound impressive. Instead, she speaks from experience, hard-earned, street-level, human experience. Where someone like Dershowitz built influence through elite spaces, Crockett built hers through the kind of work that changes lives one case, one family, one neighborhood at a time. Her authenticity is not an act. It's a culmination of the life she lived and the battles. She fought long before the political world learned her name, so when Dershowitz tried to diminish her by questioning her law degree, he wasn't just misjudging her resume, he was misjudging her entire foundation. He thought credentials defined her worth. He didn't realize her worth came from something no institution could manufacture. Her strength isn't printed on a diploma. It was forged in late-night study sessions, in overcrowded courtrooms, in community centers filled with people who believed in her long before. National audiences knew her face, and when she finally did respond to his insult, she did so not as someone intimidated by legacy, but as someone shaped by lived truth, the truth that can't be undone by condescension, no matter who delivers it. And that's exactly why she responded the way she did. The room hadn't recovered from the sting of Dershowitz's insult when he doubled down. Leaning forward with a tone that felt less like debate and more like dismissal, there was a practiced ease to his voice, the entitlement of someone accustomed to having the final word. He spoke as if Crockett were a student in his classroom, rather than a congresswoman elected by hundreds of thousands of people. His cadence quickened, sharp, and clipped, each word carrying the weight of someone who believed certainty and superiority were the same thing. He wasn't just arguing. He was performing. Convinced the audience would inevitably side with the legacy he represented, but while he raised his volume, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She remained still, hands folded, expression perfectly calm. The contrast between them was almost jarring his agitation against her measured restraint. She watched him with the composure of someone who had been underestimated too many times to bother reacting. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. And the longer she held that silence, the more it began to shift the atmosphere around her. A few seats down, one observer glanced at another, eyebrows raised. Something in the room was changing. It was subtle at first, like a temperature drop no one can quite pinpoint. The murmurs faded as people realized they were witnessing a reversal of energy, a slow but deliberate transfer of control. For the first time since the exchange began, the audience wasn't looking at Dershowitz as he spoke. They were looking at her, waiting, anticipating. Dershowitz didn't notice the shift. He kept talking, his tone narrowing into condescension, his gestures growing bigger, as if trying to fill the space her quiet confidence was overtaking. He cited case law, invoked academic tradition, and repeated his credentials like talismans meant to ward off challenge. But every time he spoke over her, every time he interrupted her attempt to interject, it became clear that he was no longer defending his point, he was defending his pride. And pride, especially in moments like this, is a way of exposing the cracks beneath. Crockett finally inhaled, just slightly, and even that felt like a cue. Cameras seemed to tilt in her direction. People leaned forward instinctively. Her composure wasn't passive. It was magnetic. For the first time all evening, even those on Dershowitz's side of the ideological aisle seemed to sense he had swung too hard, too fast, too eagerly. The optics were turning against him. Every second stretched into something slow and cinematic. His voice sounded almost distant now, as if the air between them had absorbed the weight of his arguments. Her eyes narrowed not in anger, but in focus. A quiet strength radiated from her, the kind forged in courtrooms where chaos is common but control is earned. anyone who had ever watched her work knew. This was the posture she took right before she dismantled someone's argument piece by flawless piece. A clicker of realization crossed the faces of those watching. They began picking up on the small details, the slight lift of her chin, the way her jaw set, the patience in her posture. She wasn't just preparing to speak. She was preparing to strike with precision. And every person in the room sensed it, even if Dershowitz did not. He kept going, louder now, as if volume could compensate for the unraveling authority he failed to perceive. He repeated her name, emphasizing each syllable with a patronizing emphasis that only solidified the audience's discomfort. The tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring. People weren't just waiting to hear from her, they needed to. Every moment he dragged out the monologue heightened the suspense, building the momentum toward an answer that promised to change everything. Crockett exhaled once more. Slow and steady, the kind of breath a person takes when they have finally decided enough is enough. Her eyes lifted, locking onto him with a clarity that cut through the noise. The observers felt it like a spark. A few leaned back in their chairs, bracing for impact. A couple of younger staffers exchanged knowing glances. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment the entire exchange had been building toward. And then, in one breath, she flipped the entire room. When Jasmine Crockett finally lifted her eyes from the desk, the entire room seemed to inhale at once. The tension that had been tightening like a drawn bowstring snapped into stillness, as though every molecule of air understood that the balance of power was about to shift. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his volume or his theatrics. Instead, she spoke with a calm so controlled, it felt like the first moment of clarity after a storm. "Professor," she began softly, each syllable deliberate, "I think you've misunderstood something essential about me." The tone wasn't defensive. It was surgical. And just like that, the dynamic flipped. He had been speaking down to her, and now he was forced to listen up. She leaned forward slightly. In aggression, but in precision. "You keep referencing my degree as though it's hypothetical. As though it floated to me on a breeze instead of being earned through years of work you've never bothered to ask about." She let the silence hang for half a second, just long enough for the words to sink in. Then, like a seasoned attorney laying her first exhibit on the table, she continued, "I put myself through law school. No legacy admissions. No shortcuts. No last names that open doors. Just sweat, long nights, and a commitment to a community you don't even reference unless it's to make a point on television." A murmur rippled through the audience, quick, sharp, uncontrollable. She didn't look at them. She stayed locked on him, the way a lawyer addresses a judge who needs reminding that respect goes both ways. "And while you were lecturing in classrooms where students competed for your approval," she said, "I was in actual courtrooms, real ones where people's lives hung in the balance." Her voice remained calm, but the rhythm began to build. "I represented clients who couldn't afford bail. I fought for families torn apart by a system that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with punishment. And when I stepped into civil rights litigation, it wasn't for prestige, it was because someone had to defend the people this country keeps forgetting." The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz, who shifted uncomfortably, the first crack in his confidence visible around the eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Realizing any interruption would only confirm what everyone could now see, he was losing control of the room. Crockett pressed on, unwavering. "So, when you question my understanding of the law," she said, "you're not questioning my degree. You're questioning the work I've done, the work that never needed your permission." A gasp, then a chorus of faint applause from the back rows. Even those who tried to stay neutral found themselves unable to resist the force of her clarity. She wasn't grandstanding. She was telling the truth with a grace that cut deeper than anger ever could. Then she shifted gears. "But let's talk about credentials, since you brought them up." Her voice stayed even, almost gentle, but the edge beneath it glinted like polished steel. "You built a career on academic prestige. I built mine on court transcripts and community trust. You count publications. I count people whose lives were changed because I showed up. You talk about theory. I deal with reality." And with all due respect, Professor, reality tends to be a much better teacher. A ripple of laughter, nervous from some, delighted from others. Dershowitz's jaw tightened. She leaned back, letting the room absorb the contrast. You see, the law isn't just a set of books on a shelf. It's not a resume line or a segment on cable news. It's a lived thing. It breathes. And in communities I represent, it often suffocates. She paused, expression steady. That's why I fight. That's why I'm here. For the first time, her voice deepened slightly, carrying the full weight of the years behind it. I didn't come into Congress to impress people like you. I came because the people who elected me deserve someone who knows their stories. Someone who listens. Someone who doesn't hide behind a degree to feel superior. She tilted her head, her words landing with the quiet power of a verdict. You think you're reminding me of your status? But what you're really doing is reminding us all of the gatekeeping that has held so many brilliant minds back. Several staffers exchanged glances, some with wide-eyed awe, others with restrained satisfaction. It wasn't just that she was winning the exchange. It was the ease with which she dismantled the elitism he had wrapped himself in. She spoke like someone who had nothing to prove, which made her argument land with twice the force. And here's the truth you don't seem willing to confront, she continued. You can question my degree, but you can't question my results. You can question my path, but you can't question my purpose. You can question my background, but you cannot question my backbone. The last line hit like a cinematic drumbeat. The crowd didn't just react. They felt it. Dershowitz shifted again, his face growing tighter, his confidence thinning. The cameras caught the subtle panic behind his eyes, the realization that he had misjudged not just her intellect, but her power. Crockett's closing was almost poetic. You aimed your insult at my education? She said softly. But I think everyone here understands that what intimidates you isn't my degree. It's that I earned every single piece of who I am without needing your validation. Like she let the words sit. They settled into the room like the final paragraph of a closing argument. The kind that stays echoing long after the jury leaves. Then, with the faintest smile, she delivered the line that would replay across social media within minutes. So next time you feel compelled to question my credentials, she said, try asking yourself why they threaten you. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in the stunned, visceral release that follows a perfectly landed blow. Applause thundered from corners where silence had reigned. Gasps turned into cheers. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the precision of her takedown. Her dignity never cracked. Her poise never wavered. Her truth never trembled. She didn't gloat. She didn't posture. She simply closed her binder, the gesture smooth, final. Definitive, like the soft click of a gavel signaling the end of a case, and while Dershowitz sat frozen in the weight of what had just unfolded, Jasmine Crockett remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, grounded and utterly in control. But outside that room, the real shockwaves were only beginning. The clip didn't just spread, it detonated. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett delivering her elegant surgical takedown, TikTok lit up like a controlled burn. The 30-second highlight, her calmly saying, "Ask yourself why they threaten you," became the soundtrack of 1,000 edits. Users layered it over slow-motion zooms, courtroom-style transitions, and cinematic filters that made her look like the protagonist of a political thriller. On Twitter, the hashtag Crockett Cooked shot from a few hundred mentions to the #2 trending topic in under an hour, eventually climbing to #1 as millions watched the exchange on loop. Memes exploded across every corner of the internet. Someone paired Dershowitz's stunned face with the caption, "When you realize she actually read the assignment." Another posted a split screen of Crockett's calm expression beside a chessboard, adding, "She's playing endgame while he's still moving pawns." A viral meme of a courtroom gavel slamming with the tagline, "Case closed." Professor racked up over 1 million likes before midnight. Even users who rarely posted about politics joined in, repurposing the clip into reaction videos for workplace drama, school debates, and family arguments. It wasn't just content. It was a cultural moment. Influencers chimed in almost immediately. Progressive creators broke down the exchange in slow motion, analyzing her body language, her rhetorical precision, even the cadence of her breathing before she spoke. This, one popular TikToker said, pointing to the clip, is what it looks like when someone knows who they are and refuses to shrink. Beauty influencers praised her confidence. Activists praised her control. Comedians reenacted the moment with exaggerated expressions, turning her final line into a dramatic mic drop. Then came the legal scholars. Publications that would typically ignore viral internet moments now had professors writing full-length threads about the significance of Crockett's takedown. One constitutional expert wrote, "Her argument wasn't just rhetorically powerful, it was legally airtight. She challenged the premise, reframed the debate, and exposed the elitism behind the critique." Another noted Dershowitz underestimated her because he sees the world through a lens of pedigree. Crockett dismantled that lens in under 4 minutes. Their analyses spread quickly as people who had never taken a law class shared breakdowns of her reasoning with captions like, "Smart women don't need to raise their voices." Younger women online reacted with something closer to pride. Teenagers and college students posted videos saying they felt seen for the first time in a political moment. "This is how my mom talks to people who underestimate her," one user wrote, wiping away a tear. "This is how I want to walk into job interviews." Many called Crockett their new role model, someone who taught them that intelligence doesn't require aggression and that confidence doesn't require arrogance. They stitched the clip with stories of being underestimated by teachers, employers, relatives, each ending with the same refrain, "We needed this." Older viewers, too, felt the resonance. Comment sections filled with messages like, "She reminds me of the daughters we raised. I've waited decades to watch someone like her hold her ground on a national stage." Grandmothers recorded heartfelt videos praising Crockett's poise, sharing memories of being dismissed in workplaces and community meetings. One elderly woman went viral simply by saying, "When one of us rises with dignity, all of us feel lifted."
Oh.
Journalists dove into the moment with their own interpretations. Think pieces, op-eds, and headline analysis flooded major outlets. Some framed it as a generational clash, others as a symbolic confrontation between elitism and lived experience. Editorial boards noted how unusual it was to see such a clean rhetorical victory in a political environment defined by noise and spectacle. The tone across articles varied. The theme remained the same. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she changed the mood of the nation. Even if only for a moment. Even political opponents, individuals who rarely gave her credit, acknowledged her mastery. One conservative commentator admitted on live television, "Look, I disagree with her politics, but facts are facts. She handled herself better than most seasoned debaters I've seen." Another grudgingly tweeted, "I'll be honest, Crockett had the stronger case." Those comments, small as they were, only amplified the magnitude of her performance. When ideological opponents show respect, the impact is undeniable. And through it all, the internet came to a stunningly unified conclusion. This wasn't a fight between equals. It was a clash between old power and new integrity, between entitlement and earned authority. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she exposed the fragile scaffolding of elitism that had been used for generations to shut out people like her. But the biggest impact wasn't online, it was personal. In the quiet that followed the digital storm, something deeper settled into place, something beyond politics, beyond personalities. Beyond the momentary thrill of watching arrogance meet its match, what Jasmine Crockett showed wasn't merely rhetorical skill or legal sharpness. It was the power of dignity in a world that often rewards the loudest voice instead of the truest one. Her response reminded millions that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly, clearly, and with the kind of certainty that makes people rethink everything they thought they knew about power. Because dignity, when wielded with precision, becomes its own form of force. It disarms those who rely on intimidation. It exposes the hollowness behind elitist assumptions. It reminds the world that credentials might open doors, but character determines what you do once you're inside. Crockett didn't need to shout to defend her worth. She didn't need to weaponize her resume. She simply stood, rooted in who she was, and in doing so, revealed a truth many forget. You don't need permission from the powerful to be powerful. And for anyone who has ever been underestimated, her moment resonated like a bell struck in the center of the soul. People saw themselves in her not because they shared her career or her path, but because they knew what it felt like to be dismissed before being heard, to be talked over before being understood, to be judged not on ability, but on identity. Crockett's calm refusal to shrink under scrutiny offered something rare, a real-time example of how to reclaim narrative without losing grace. Her message wasn't just in what she said, but in how she said it. She turned an attack on her education into a broader lesson on the meaning of expertise. She transformed an attempted humiliation into a moment of collective pride for those who have fought to earn every step forward. She showed that attacks on identity are nothing new, but the way one responds can rewrite the story entirely. And that rewriting doesn't happen with rage alone. It happens with clarity, with conviction, and with the unwavering belief that one's lived experience is not inferior to anyone's pedigree. For young people watching, especially young women of color, her takedown wasn't just entertainment. It was instruction. It was permission. It was a blueprint for resilience in spaces where their presence is questioned before their contributions are recognized. Crockett didn't just counter an insult. She demonstrated how to remain grounded in self-worth while the world tries to shake it loose. She embodied the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone redefine you. And for older viewers who spent a lifetime weathering similar battles without the platform to respond, her moment felt like overdue vindication. It felt like a whisper to every person who had been told they didn't belong in a classroom, a workplace, a courtroom, a position of leadership. Her response stitched together the generational weight of being underestimated and transformed it into something lighter, a reminder that progress isn't theoretical. It can be seen. It can be felt. It can be lived. The deeper meaning of Crockett's response wasn't just political triumph. It was human triumph. It was proof that one person's dignity can challenge an entire hierarchy. It was proof that truth spoken calmly can be louder than arrogance shouted. It was proof that the world is shifting not quickly, not perfectly, but undeniably toward a version of leadership that values authenticity over elitism and resilience over ego. Moments like this don't fade easily. They sink in. They ripple. They give people courage they didn't know they were looking for. They change the way a young girl raises her hand in class. They change the way an immigrant prepares for a job interview. They change the way someone walks into a room where they expect to be dismissed. Crockett's response, distilled down to its essence, told millions, you belong here. Your story belongs here. Your voice belongs here. And that's why it transcends the incident itself. Because long after the tweets fade and the memes stop circulating, the lesson remains. Dignity is not passive. It is active. It is powerful. And when wielded with intention, doesn't just defend, it inspires. And that brings us to the one question this video leaves you with. Alan Dershowitz insults Jasmine Crockett's law degree. Her response. It was more than a headline. It was a snapshot of a moment where arrogance collided with authenticity, and authenticity won. What began as a condescending jab meant to diminish her instead revealed the strength she had carried long before the cameras turned on. Crockett didn't just answer an insult, she transformed it into a lesson, a statement. A reminder that dignity is its own form of authority. And that's why this moment matters. Not because of the controversy, not because of the clash, but because of what her response represents, the power of knowing your worth even when someone tries to question it. The courage to stay grounded when someone tries to shake you, the clarity to speak truth without sacrificing grace. Her response wasn't rehearsed or dramatic for the sake of spectacle. It was the natural expression of someone who has lived the reality behind the resume now. The story belongs to all of us. Moments like this challenge us to think about how we respond when underestimated, how we hold our ground when someone tries to make us feel small, how we carry ourselves when the world tests our confidence. Crockett's example reminds us that we don't have to shout to be heard. We don't have to match anyone's arrogance to prove our intelligence. We just have to stand firm in who we are. If this moment resonated with you, it inspired you, validated you, or gave you a sense of pride, then let this be the beginning, not the end. Share this story. Leave a comment about a time you stood your ground. Subscribe if you want more moments where truth meets power and dignity rises above noise. Join the community that refuses to shrink in the face of condescension. Because these stories aren't just political, they're personal. And together, we make them impossible to ignore.